So we're here to talk about the future of data. And specifically, I want to take you over the next hour over two main things. The first one is this idea about what is the future of interacting with data, visualizing data, exposing data, monetizing data, whether it's on the web or in the cloud or in your enterprises. And so I want you to go away with just a feel for how we're kind of viewing data nowadays and how you should think about it. And then what I'm going to try and do in the next hour, and we should get through this, is show you three really exciting technologies which really enforce the messages. So I'm going to use the technology both to give you a preview of the different technologies. So I'm going to show you Project Dallas, I'm going to show you OData, and I'm going to show you Pivot from Live Labs. And I'm going to use those to basically string together a view of what this kind of new data paradigm looks like. For those of you I haven't met, I am Graham Elliott, and well, welcome to the Elliott Room. It was nice of them to name the room after me. I was thanking Terry for that before, but I think they were just taking the piss actually by putting me in this room. I'm actually the Azure Platform Advisor for Australia and New Zealand, although we're not actually going to talk about Azure much today. So let's start off with this idea about, let me go back, that data is a first-class citizen now. So if you look at how we traditionally build web applications, enterprise applications, whether it's a WinForms application or it's a web-based application we put out there for the public to use, largely what we do now is we bundle the data with the presentation and the behavioural logic that operates on that data. And the data is really just there to support the behaviour of the application. Yeah? It's not really an entity in its own right. But what we're seeing, if you look at new and emerging technologies like Ajax, RIA, Mashups, whatever they are, or even if you're just building a new front end to your mainframe services or your Kix transactions or your DB2 data on the mainframe, what we're really seeing is a separation of this data from the presentation and the behavioural logic that comes with it. Before I actually became the Azure Platform Advisor, I was actually a solution architect in Microsoft Consulting Services for quite a number of years. And the biggest thing I had to work with customers about is how do I expose my data from the mainframe, right, or the I series or the Z series, right? And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the web or the cloud or whatever, data is becoming this service, right, that we need to treat as a first-class citizen. And what complicates this matter is the interaction patterns that we operate on this data have changed, right? So it's no longer basically I say, hey, give me, in a synchronous manner, the drop-down values for this field, right? Now, especially with things like Ajax and RIA services, the interaction patterns with the data are different. I don't know when the data's coming back. It's not necessarily tied to the presentation itself. And what you actually see is a reversal of fortunes almost. You see the tail starting to wag the dog, where the application is responding to the data versus the application just using the data that it's demanding. Yeah? And what we actually see is it goes further than that, in that it's not just one piece of data you generally have to deal with, it's many pieces of data. And they could be from different sources, right? So this obviously causes us a problem, but before we go into that, there's really kind of two questions that this raises. If you accept that premise for a second, that data is a first-class citizen and needs to be treated as a valuable service, the first question is, what type of data are we talking about? And it ranges from everything from public data, so data that should be public and is largely being made public today. So this is things like government data, scientific data, that sort of stuff. There's social data, so Facebook data, Twitter data, that sort of stuff. And if you want a classic example of this, the best example sort of in the wild is Twitter, right? Twitter is not an application. Twitter is the data. Right? That's why nearly no one uses the actual Twitter website, right? They'll use TweetDeck or they'll use some other application on top of the data, because the application is just there to serve the data. So we've got public or social, we've got your own commercial data, whether that's data that you simply need to expose from your back-end services or your back-end mainframes or SQL databases or whatever it is, and then expose that in a consistent manner. Or it's data that organisations expose for a commercial premise. So TechEd, for example, we expose our session data. And we do that for a commercial reason, right? We do it, we don't charge you for it, but we do it so that you'll enter into agreement with us. It's good for business to advertise the session data. Yeah? And then the last kind of emerging pattern is this idea of premium data. All right? So if you want, for example, traffic and street data, you can go to Navtech, for example, today, and you can buy a CD, you know, $100,000, $1 million, whatever it costs, right? And you get the data and you install it, and you've got basically this, you know, this stream of data you can use now. If you want weather data, you can go and get that. You might charge a premium, for example, if you want mapping data, if you want business intelligence data, right? Intelligence on businesses, right? You can go and get that data today. And so that's the first question. The second question I need to answer is, so what do I want in this new world, right? What do I need to operate? And there's a number of things I want. The first is, if I'm a publisher of data, if I own data, I want to play in this new world and I want to monetize this data. Yeah? So I want a way to host, expose and monetize the data. If I'm a consumer of the data, I want to find where the premium content provider of that data is. Who is the best provider of weather data? Who is the best provider of business data, of traffic data, of whatever data that I want to consume? And we're going to look at Project Dallas for that. Yeah? What I also want as a developer is I want a consistent experience over that data. Yeah? So if we take ourselves out of the enterprise for a second and say, well, let's start, you know, I might be building an application which I need to put in, you know, register a new business, and I want to look up automatically what the business details are, what their address is, contact details, you know, where they are, you know, who the primary contact point is, right? Where do I get that data from if I don't want to, you know, have to manually enter it, right? What I want is I want a consistent way to find who the premium provider of that data is, yeah? And I want a consistent commercial experience with that person and the same person I use mapping data for and the same person I use weather data for. All right? I'm not talking about charging the same cost, but I want the same SLAs. Yeah? And I want the same licensing arrangements. Yeah? And that, again, that's what Project Dallas is going to be, and I'll take you through this. The next one is from a technical point of view. I want a consistent technical experience over that data. And I want that whether I'm consuming data from Project Dallas or I'm consuming data that I expose from my mainframe. Yeah? And so what I want is I want a first class or a great protocol experience. Yeah? But what I also want is I want to be able to pick and choose pieces of data, whether it's I want this piece of data from DB2 and this piece of data from the web and this piece of data from the cloud, and I want to understand how to semantically join it together. Yeah? So if you actually look at what the founders of the web, you know, 15, 20, 30 years ago were thinking, is that they wanted the web essentially to be just this large collection of loosely joined pieces of information that you can pick and choose from. And we're finally getting to that point, right? Because data now is so valuable. So I want a way to pick and choose this and have a great protocol experience. And that's what OData gives us. So we're going to look at OData for those two things. And then the last thing, if you join those two together and say, okay, well that's great, I get this great data feed, right? That's awesome, I can put it in JSON, XML, whatever format I want. But that's not useful for users. What I actually want is I then want a data-driven, immersive experience over that data. So I don't want the applications just to dictate how I present the data. I want the data itself to drive an immersive experience. There's a lot of technologies emerging around that, a lot of interaction patterns for that. I'm just going to show you one, which is Live Pivot from Live Labs, which is an awesome little tool I'll show you. So let's jump into these quickly. So the first one, let's monetize valuable data. Yeah. So Project Dallas really does two things for you. Allows you to monetize data as a publisher, and as a consumer of data, it allows me to find who is the premium content provider for data, and it gives me a standard commercial experience over that data. So the first thing it is, it's a marketplace. It joins consumers of data with publishers of data. Yeah? And we're stepping outside of the enterprise at the moment. We're talking about data in the cloud or in the web. It then gives me standard data access patterns across those, right? Leveraging the next step down, which is OData, which we'll talk about. And then it gives me a whole bunch of standard billing infrastructure, a whole set of analytics, and a whole set of platform type things that as a publisher of data, I would have to generally build myself. The best way to kind of explain this is to actually demo it to you. So let me just switch over to this guy, wake my PC up. Hello? There we go. So if I go to the Dallas portal, the Dallas developer portal, if my machine won't start, the first thing you'll notice, if I zoom in on this, right? Oh, not that far. Right? It's SQLAzureServices.com, right? Which should tell you one thing straight up, right? This whole thing is hosted on Azure. Dallas is basically an extension or evaluated service we're building on top of Azure. And what I get is I've signed in, you can see. And so if I go to my home, it basically just describes, hey, this is what Dallas is. Here's the benefits you get. And then these are the catalogs. You can see it's in CTP3 at the moment, so it's still very early in the release days, but it is coming down the track. And you can see I've got, data from Associated Press, data from, the government in the United States. I've got business data from Infogroup, basically provides me the information about US, UK and Canadian companies. So, what's their turnover, who the contact points are. So if I'm building an application today that basically I'm trying to build relationships, I'm trying to enter customers' information, I can basically look up the Infogroup data sources and basically take all of their, pre-populate all of their consistent data. You can see at the moment the prices are all zero because basically it's CTP, so we're not actually charging for any of the data at the moment. But as a publisher of data, what you'll get is you'll get the ability to set your own prices, right? While we provide consumers with a consistent commercial experience, you get to set your own end-user license agreements, you get to set your own subscription types, you get to set your own trial times, your own costs and that sort of thing. And then we will consistently on-bill the consumers of that data. You can see I can get weather data. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here. I can get, down here we've got NASA data, etc., National Geographic. So what you'll see is both public and commercial data starting to be exposed through Dallas as premium data. At the moment, the data sources are all US-based, but obviously as we go into production, you're going to see basically data from around the world. So Australia, New Zealand, the premium content providers are going to be on this. And so what I do as a user is you can see I get this account key, all right? If I sign in, I want to sign in as that guy. All right. You can see I get this account key, which essentially is how Dallas identifies who to on-bill to or who to bill back to. And then what I get is I subscribe to data. So let's just go and say, hey, let's just give an example. Which one? I haven't subscribed to this one. Let's subscribe to this. Infogroup has their own end-user license agreement because I'm actually entering into agreement with the end publisher of this data. Let's subscribe to that, and now I've basically got these subscriptions. And then I can start consuming this data. And there's a number of ways to navigate Dallas data. The easiest way and the most interesting from a demo point of view is to use the Service Explorer, which is basically this. It's just an interactive website, again, hosted in Azure, that allows me to explore this data. So let's just, for example, have a look at all the images from the NASA Mars rover thingamajiggy mission. Right? You can see I've got different operations I can perform on this data. Let's go ahead and invoke that. And I get a giant picture of a bum by the look of it. Let's try and actually get a better picture for you there. Let's grab this guy. Retrieve that guy. And there you go. That's Mars. That's the Mars rover mission thing, right? And these are actually 3D images. If you actually were to put all these together, you get this amazing 3D view of the world. Or not our world, their world, I guess. And so what I get is I get the ability then to kind of query and interact with this data set. And there's three things I can do with this. I can invoke the data, which actually just invokes a REST service, or more specifically, it invokes an OData service, which I'll talk about later. I can preview this data, right, which basically just brings it up in here, which is that grid you saw before. Or I can actually, the Analyze button for the single data set is grayed out, but if I go to the search operation, right, you can see I've got the Analyze. And what that will do is if you've got Power Pivot for Excel, right, it will load it up in Power Pivot for you, and you can basically run data analysis over the data sets that are consumed. So that's an interesting way to consume the data. The other way I can consume the data is you can see here we provide at the moment a service class or a service proxy. So if I save this off, where do I want to put it? In here, let's replace the one I've got. Thank you. Let's load up Dallas demo. So what I've got here, I've got a very basic, simple Windows Forms application. I've literally gone create new project Windows Forms. And I've just dropped a data grid on it, right? It has no code in it, it has nothing else. So what I want to do, I'm just going to add that existing, let's go this way. Add my existing proxy. So you can see my proxy class is here. And essentially what this has done, and I'm actually what I might do is not use that data set. Let's use a different data set because it gives me more interesting data. Let's have a look at sign in as you. Let's use the Associated Press one. So the Associated Press data source essentially just gives me a news feed, right, for data. Oh, sorry, a news feed for, whether it's international headlines, technology news, etc., etc. Let's grab this proxy class instead. Let's just remove you. So if I have a look at this guy, what you can see is I get basically a class per service endpoint that this service provides, or this Dallas service provides. So you can see I get news category service, news by category service, search, news service, etc., etc. And if we drill down, we're going to use this news category service. You can see literally all it is, all right, is it basically is just a wrapper for a HTTP web request. Yeah, you can see it's hard-coded in here, what the URI to the service is, right? So it's just a REST-based service endpoint, and all it's going to do is basically take my account key. So then what I do is let's have a look at the code behind this, just to quickly show you how I go about consuming this. And then like any other service proxy I get, resolve that reference. Basically all I'm doing is, get rid of you, I'm just instantiating an instance of the news category service class. I'm just setting the account key, and then I'm just invoking the service and binding it to the data grid. Make sense? So if I run this now, God willing, I'll go out to the Dallas data service, and I've just retrieved the data specific for that data set. Yeah? So let me just close this little guy down. So have a think for a second about what we just did. Yeah? So we went out to a marketplace, which is Dallas. We looked for premium content providers. We said, I want this one because this one's useful for my business. We subscribe to that, right? And then we consume that data. Yep, all within a good, 3 minutes or whatever it took us to do that, right? And then no matter which of those data sets I use, I get exactly the same experience, right? That's what Dallas is about. Now, I've lost my little clicker thing. I won't go through this in detail, but I just want to give you an idea about the architecture of Dallas, right? As I've kind of mentioned already, the whole thing is based on Windows Azure, right? So that portal we looked at runs on the compute roles in Windows Azure. The storage is either in Windows Azure Storage or SQL Azure Storage. Having said that, you don't have to use our storage if you want to expose your data sets through Dallas. You can use any other third-party cloud database, or you can actually use your own data sources if you want, but you have to be able to meet the SLAs. And so what does this give publishers and consumers? So consumers, obviously, it gives me as a business, if I do need to get weather data, just say I'm a an organisation that makes deliveries, and I want to mash up weather data with traffic data with mapping data, right? And also business data to be able to locate specific business, contact points and that sort of stuff. If I want to mash that up today, right, to basically, guide my delivery trucks, then I can do that, but I have to go to each of those 4 individual data providers, and I have to enter a commercial agreement with them. One of them gives me a CD, one of them gives me, some USB stick, one of them gives me some half-baked web service. It's a completely different experience over each one. And I don't know the one that I'm consuming is the premium content provider. So for consumers, it's a fairly easy value proposition. For publishers, it is as well. So what I get for publishers is you can monetize data today. But what Dallas gives you is it gives you breadth, right? It gives you breadth that you get exposed to all of our information workers, you get exposed to all of our developers, and you get exposed via our consumer-based applications. Yeah? But what you also get is you get all of these services down the bottom. You get billing and discovery, authentication, account, management, and ops. Right? Stuff you'd have to build yourself if you were going to kind of expose and try to monetize your data. Or even if you're not trying to monetize data, if you're a public entity, simply the ability to expose data out of your data sources is quite a difficult thing to do normally. So that's Dallas. The last thing I'll say about Dallas, if you are interested in being a content provider to Dallas, there is a content publication bar. And the reason behind this is we're not trying to be the, Apple App Store of data. This is about the premium content providers. Yeah? So if you're a public source of data, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics is a good example, right? Census data, CPI data, that sort of stuff. They are the authority public source of data, right? So that we're going to allow them to get on Dallas, right? If you're a commercial publisher, you need to be recognised as a leading commercial publisher. Right? And what leading means changes depending on what industry you're in. It could be by revenue, etc., etc. And it's country specific. So you don't have to be, for example, the worldwide leader of mapping data, right? But you generally will need to be the worldwide or the local mapping data leader. So in the US, it's Navtech, for example, which is why they're up there, right? You also obviously have to have the rights to distribute the data, and you need to make the data available for a minimum period of time. That's because as consumers of data, you want to make sure the data is going to be there for at least 12 months. You don't want to have to change your app every 3 months. And there's also a bunch of SLAs about you need to be able to support the right amount of throughput, the right amount of scalability, etc., etc. Which is why we offer our cloud platform for you to store your data in, so that you don't have to have your data centers needing to scale up to the potentially millions of users who are going to access your data. Yeah? So that's great, right? That's Dallas. I've got this awesome marketplace. Now, what you kind of got a little bit of a view on top of that, is I need a consistent technical experience over that. And I want that over Dallas data, I want it over public data, I want it over databases I store in my own systems. I want it over my mainframe, right? If I want to expose data from DB2 or Kix transaction, right? I want a consistent technical experience over that. And so we've been working on this thing called OData for years, right? Anyone heard of Project Astoria? Right? This used to be Project Astoria. Then it was ADO Data Services, ADO.NET Data Services. Now what we've done is we've actually separated the protocol experience from the actual technical implementation in the .NET platform. So the protocol experience is this thing we call the Open Data Protocol, which has been released into the wild as an open data protocol. Right? The internal implementation is called WCF Data Services. That's how you consume it on our platform. But if you want to expose data from the mainframe and you put IBM's WebSphere Web Services stack on the mainframe, for example, they have an implementation of OData as well. So what is OData? The easiest way to describe it is it's basically a thin set of conventions over HTTP. Now that's important. Two things. It's a thin set of conventions and it leverages HTTP. The whole thing is designed to be web friendly. We've learned over the last 15 years that if we try and invent things for the web, life is very, very difficult, right? It's much easier if we just use what's on the web. So we use HTTP, right? We use the standard HTTP verbs. We use the standard addressing. We use the standard JSON, Atom, and XML markups, right? Because then you as an organization, whether you're exposing data from your internal systems or trying to consume it from the cloud, don't have to do anything with your infrastructure. Your firewalls don't have to change. Your proxy settings don't have to change. Yeah? What it actually provides you is three things in these conventions. The first one is simply a unified way of representing structured data. Yeah? So instead of getting 10 different types of feeds from different data sources, I basically get a consistent data source experience. Yeah? I also get these uniform URL conventions. So I navigate data the same, I filter data the same, I sort data the same, I page data the same. Right? And it's all hyperlink driven. So if I want to go and retrieve the top 10 entities in a data set, I use exactly the same URL scheme as I would across your mainframe data or your public data. It doesn't matter. Yeah? And because it's all hyperlink driven, we can start to build these semantic relationships between data sets. Yeah? Which means any hypermedia client, whether it's the browser or whether it's code you write, can navigate this structure. And I'll show you a little bit of a cool demo later where I'm actually going to visualize what a data set looks like just by understanding the OData feed. What it also gives us is a uniform interface. So if I want to query data, I use a HTTP GET. Yep. If I want to insert data, I use a HTTP POST. If I want to update, I use a PUT. If I want to delete, I use a delete. It's just standard REST-based HTTP protocols. Yeah? And we have a standard URL-based addressability scheme. So let's have a look at what this thing looks like. What I'm going to do is give you two little quick demos. I'm going to consume some OData stuff, and then I'm actually going to show you how to expose your own OData services. So the most interesting place to go, if you are interested in OData, is odata.org. And what this lists is basically a whole bunch of dev info, but also what the producers and consumers are. So you can see SharePoint's here, WebSphere's here, Azure's here, obviously. There's a whole bunch of live OData services. I like playing with this Netflix one, just because it's kind of interesting data. So Netflix is an online DVD and movie kind of streaming and selling service in the US. It's extremely large to the point where Paul Allen's suing them at the moment along with everyone else. It's always a good indication if you're a large company or not, and if it's worth looking at your data is, are you getting sued at the moment? So if I hit their OData endpoint, I get this. It's called a service catalog. It's actually a standard Atom concept. It really is just almost an index of what type of data and entities I'm exposing. So you can see I expose genres, languages, people, title auto formats, titles, etc., etc. If I go and explore one of these, let's go to titles. What I get, if it goes, come on, I get no data feed. Sorry, I get an Atom feed. All right? That is just a standard Atom feed. What I'll do is I'll actually turn off Internet Explorer's Atom feed view, feed reading view, because I don't want it to look pretty at the moment. So that is the underlying Atom feed. You can see it's just basically the same as if you're doing an RSS feed. There are some differences to this though. There's some OData differences. We have hyperlink-driven navigation for how entities relate to each other. We have strongly typed data in here, right? So what type of data is the title? What type of data is the audio format, etc., etc.? That's not the most interesting thing about OData. This is the most interesting thing for my mind, is that I can start to do sophisticated things. So what we've layered is a whole bunch of conventions. So if I want to filter data, let me just zoom in on this for you. I say, dollar filter. If I want to order by, I do dollar order by. And that is the same convention. Let me get out of that. And that is the same convention whether I'm talking to Netflix or I'm going to talk to my own mainframe data. right? How I query data and how I order data and sort data is exactly the same. What I can also do is, because this is standard HTTP, I can do standard type negotiations. So I'm using HTTP Fiddler here. Everyone use Fiddler? It's basically a HTTP debugging tool. And the reason I'm going to use this is because all I'm going to do, let's see if I've got it, odata.netflix.com-catalog, and let's ask for titles, top equals 10. So I'm saying just give me the top 10 and I get a 502 because I obviously... oh, okay, yeah, of course. Let's get rid of that guy. Let's try you. And that looks better. I get a 200, right? And I get the same data through, right? Here's my XML. You know, the top one is this Red Hot Chili Peppers Funky Monks, if you ever want to go and watch that. It's a top 10 one. That's not interesting. That's just what I actually did in the browser. It's just here I've just run a different query against it. What's more interesting, if I do accept application JSON, again, if I can spell, right? If I execute this, then what I've just got, instead of XML, right, instead of angle brackets, I've got curly brackets, because that's JSON. Because I've just done type negotiation with OData, and what's really interesting here is you can see this hyperlink-driven interaction I get between the data sets. So if I go ahead and say, hey, let's have a look at, for this, whatever this one is, where are we? The Red Hot Chili Peppers guys, let's have a look at what language this comes in, right? You can see it takes me to the related data set which says, hey, this is in English. So you can see I can start to semantically join this data. So how do I consume this as a .NET user? Right? As a .NET user, I use something called WCF Data Services. So all I need to do here is add a service reference. And we're going to add a service reference to my catalog, my OData catalog. We'll select you, and you can see it already understands that it is a WCF data service. Yeah? Let's go ahead and say, yes, I want you. Right? It's added a little service reference for me. If I double click on the service reference, obviously it's smart enough to understand, because OData is self-describing, these are the different entities I've got. Yeah. What's kind of more interesting is if I view this as a diagram, let's add all the namespaces, let's zoom out because the resolution on these projectors really sucks. Okay, what you can see, oh, I should probably sign out of that. You can see that Visual Studio understands that title is related, has a many-to-many relationship with genre, has a many-to relationship with language, has a one-to-many relationship, whatever is over here. It has some complex types in it called box art, etc., etc. Because OData semantically defines how these data elements are interacting. Yeah? And that is extremely powerful if I'm consuming this data. And you'll see later, when I actually go to publish some of this data, there's very little work in you doing that for your own internal data sets. Yeah? And so how I consume this now is if I go to, this is just a basic console app, so if I just go to the main, let me do the old magical copy and paste. Right? Essentially all I'm doing is I'm saying, again, talk to the proxy service. In this case, because it's a generic proxy, I have to put in the URI of the endpoint. So in this case, it's catalog. And then I'm saying, hey, for all the titles, select the titles that have a release year of 2010. This is a link statement, if you've never seen link before. Basically, order by average rating, right? And then just select the top 10, and then just spit them out to the console. If I spin this up now, I'm basically just going to go out to this service and say, hey, here's the top 10. Right? What's really cool about this is if I just put a breakpoint, let's put him here, and spin this up again. All right? If I have a look at the all titles, you can see this is just basically using the URI addressability scheme of OData to say, actually go and get this endpoint, all right? And so if you have a look at that, and let's copy that actually. Let's do a, oops. Let's just do a quick watch on that. Let's copy this guy. Let's go back here. Of course, if I had to copy the right thing, all right? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah. What I've done exactly the same as the code did because I'm just talking to an OData REST-based API. Yeah. So that's OData. So what have we done, right? We've looked at how do I start to monetize my data, publish my data, and as a developer, how do I consume my data? Yeah. In a consistent technical experience. If I want to use commercial data from the web to enhance my enterprise applications, that's what Dallas is going to give me. And then OData gives me a consistent protocol experience over what I'm consuming from the web, but also what I can expose locally. So who currently actually exposes OData feeds and uses OData feeds? The first interesting one is if you've got SharePoint 2010 in your enterprise, every single list, every single document library is exposed as an OData head or has an OData head, which means you can query it exactly the same way we just queried the Netflix data. Yeah? If you are using Office Excel 2010, you can consume OData feeds through PowerPivot. Yeah? PowerPivot, for those that don't know, is our new self-service BI interface. It used to be called Project Gemini, if you love our code names. But then pretty much any Microsoft-based server application that can publish data is going to publish it as OData. Yeah? And any client-based tool is going to be able to consume OData because it's all about that consistency. But then expanding on that, we're working with jQuery, PHP, RESTlet and Palm and others in the industry to do the same thing. And like you saw, IBM WebSphere already has an implementation of OData. So if you don't want to use .NET, and use WebSphere, whether it's a WebSphere stack on the mainframe or whether it's a mid-range WebSphere stack, you can do everything I'm doing today. It's just they don't call it WCF Data Services, obviously. But it doesn't matter, right? On the wire, it looks the same. So that's the place to go if you want to know more. Before I move off OData, I've showed you how to consume OData. Let's quickly show you how to publish OData. And there's a number of things I can do. The first one is I can take a simple flat file, put it as an OData format, and I've exposed an OData feed. Yeah? But what I can do then is I can put a service document on top of that, and that service document is that landing page you saw. And then I can start doing some interesting queries over the data. Then I can add a metadata file. And the metadata file allows me to understand the structure of the data without downloading the data. So if I have those three just static files, I've got a queryable, self-describing OData service. But what I probably want is I want to overlay it over a database and run some queries with URIs. So I can do that as well. But then I can say, actually, query's great, but I want to use the other HTTP verbs and I want to be able to read and write. And if I read and write data, I want to be able to do authorization, concurrency. I want to be able to intercept the requests and extend OData with behaviors. So I can do that as well. Yeah? So you can do optimistic concurrency with OData. Right? So basically you get an E tag back when you request data, and when you go to update the data, you send back the same E tag. But if I'm building real applications with this, I also need things like batch versioning, and I also need to be able to just expose static functions as well. Right? So I can do that with OData as well. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how to expose a database as an OData feed. And we give you that provider out of the box. But you can put an OData head over anything you want. Right? So if you wanted to rewrite the SharePoint provider, you can do that. Or you can write your own providers for anything else. So I'm going to very quickly show you how to write or how to expose an OData feed or publish an OData feed. So I've got a simple web-based application here that's empty. I'm just going to add in just a very, very simple database. My Nerd Dinner, if you're not familiar with Nerd Dinner, it's basically we'll put that in AppData. Yep. Basically what it is, it's just an MVC sample application that was released by the ASP.NET team, which just shows you how to build an ASP.NET MVC solution. And then what I want to do is the easiest way in .NET to publish an OData feed is to use an entity data model. Right? So an entity data model, if you're not familiar with it, essentially creates an object to relational mapping layer over my database. So instead of having to write, select, insert, update, delete statements, I can basically just interact with an object layer on top of the database so that I don't have to write that logic or those stored procedures. And it also allows me to transform the data at the object layer. If I want to change the names, if I want to make them more user-friendly, etc., etc. So as this guy kind of scurries out, oh, that's not good. What's wrong with that guy? Let me try deleting you. Let's try adding in an entity model again. Why isn't that working? Let me just load a previous one I did, which I know works. Let's grab you. Okay, so it's got exactly the same thing, but this one actually does work. So you can see I've got the Nerd Dinner in there. I've actually added this entity data model, right? And so the entity data model, it just runs through the wizard and says, here's the two tables, right, that I want to expose as an object model, right, dinner and RSVP. And then all I do is I basically right-click on here and say, hey, add a new item, and I want to add a WCF data service, because that's how .NET knows about OData. So let's have a look at the one I previously created. All right. So all this actually is you can see, it's not the one I want. Let's add another one. New item, let's add a WCF data service. Right? So I've just added a new WCF data service, and what it gives me is it basically just gives me a service that inherits from this thing called data service. And what's interesting is when the document cache catches up to me, what you can see is this, right? Says it's the main data entry point for developing an ADO.NET data service, right? So if you're bored on the weekend, the great thing to do in the .NET framework is actually do a bit of archaeological discovery, because the product groups are generally quite bad at updating their documentation with the code name. So if you dig down on that further, you'll go from WCF data service to ADO.NET data service to Project Astoria somewhere down the bottom. And then basically all I say is, hey, so this is actually what type of data service is it? And it is a Nerd Dinner, right, entities data service. And then all I need to do is say, what are my set entity access rules? So I'm going to say, hey, expose everything and give everyone all read access to this. Make sense? So what I can do here is I can do some quite sophisticated things. Obviously, from an access rights point of view, I can say who reads, who writes, who appends, who deletes, etc., etc. And I can get very, very sophisticated on this to the point where I can actually just say, you know what, just add specific behaviours. So if a request comes in, I can say, actually, just call off to this method, which is actually just a behavior. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. What's wrong? Oopsie. Let's try that. Actually, I want to delete that guy because you're the old one. So if I spin this up, it's running in my local dev server. If I actually had have set my starting point, which is you, what you can see is I get the same service document I got with the Netflix one, right? And so I can go ahead and say, hey, show me all the dinners. Yep. And then I can say, hey, show me all the dinners and show me the top 10. So what I've done is I've very simply created an OData head that's queryable. If I had allowed update access, it's updatable, etc., etc. I did that over a very, very simple database, but you can do it over any data source you want. You just have to change that provider. Now, the very last thing I want to quickly show you is Pivot from Live Labs. So all that data is fantastic, but your users don't want to deal with OData feeds, Atom feeds. So one of the things that we've released is this idea of Pivot from Live Labs. Has anyone seen this? No? Sweet. You'll love this. It really has two different scenarios that we're trying to aim this at. One is the explore and inspire scenario. That's give me a data set that I've seen 1,000 times and show me new insights into that data set. Yeah? Let me find different patterns that I haven't seen before. The other one is navigate and act. How do I find a needle in a haystack? Yeah? Pivot is basically a data-driven experience. It is essentially made up of just 3 files, right, and a bunch of images. The 3 files are 3 XML files. One is called CXML. It's collection metadata, and I'll show you these. They'll make a bit more sense. That is essentially just describes, here is all the data that I want you to show, and here's the behavior I want you to do. So essentially, this is your OData feed for all intents and purposes, right? That is the data. Then what these 2 things are, Deep Zoom collections and Deep Zoom items. So anyone know what Deep Zoom is? Deep Zoom's a technology that allows you to take a very high-res image and stream it over the web so that what you can do is you start off from a very distant view of it and you get a very low-res image, and as you kind of zoom in on it, you get different images of the same image coming back. So you get a very smooth streaming experience. And how it actually works is the Deep Zoom collections actually define a pyramid of images. So let's say I've got an image of my head, right? Beautiful image that it would be. Essentially what I do is I create a pyramid of my head, right? I create an image that's a long way away and then an image that's closer, and then I keep going closer and closer, and eventually when I want to zoom in, I actually get a pyramid of about 20 different images of different parts of my head. That's what a deep zoom image is. But essentially they're just served up based on the data that comes back. And let me just show you this, it's much easier to explain. All this is generated for you, by the way. You don't actually have to do this, you just have to have the images. So OData actually, Pivot actually comes in 2 flavors. One is a desktop application which you can run from your desktop, but you grab the collection from the web. The other one is a Silverlight-based application, and I'll show you an example of that we built for a customer in Australia. So let me load up just the desktop version at the moment, just to give you an idea on what Pivot is. So there's an online Pivot gallery you can have a look at. And essentially what Pivot does is it says, I've got Wikipedia here, and Wikipedia is a dynamic collection. There's 3 types of collections you can have. One is a static collection, which is just, hey, here's my data, display it. There's a linked collection, which basically says, here's three different data sets of data, join them all together. And then there's a dynamic collection where the Wikipedia one actually goes out to Wikipedia, takes a feed from Wikipedia and basically renders it as a Pivot feed. Yeah. But if let's just take, I don't know, endangered species is an interesting one. Right? So this is basically streaming all of these images off the web. So what I can do is I can say, actually, show me population trends, right? I can see them as a grid view or a histogram view. Let's have a look at the decreasing population, right? And what I can do is I can zoom in on this, and what you'll see is because they're deep zoom images, they'll render as I come through. Now the great thing about this is because they're high-res images, I can embed an enormous amount of information into them. So you can see down the bottom here, I can embed this map, right? And so I can pivot on this information. I can say, hey, show me just things that are in Mexico and show me the population trends. Now, this is completely data-driven. That's the thing you need to understand, right? The application is just there to serve the data. And I'll show you what the data looks like by showing you, there's a company in Australia called Coles, large grocery chain. Do you have it in New Zealand? No. But basically it's our largest grocery chain. They have a group called Coles Liquor, which has 3 different liquor brands. The premium wine selling brand is Vintage Cellars. I've been, as part of my previous MCS life, consulting life, we were building out with one of our partners their new e-commerce websites. And what we did as an example of how to find information and explore a product range is we actually built a pivot front end to their wine catalogue. Now the reason this is compelling is because if I'm a Vintage Cellars consumer, what I want to be able to do is I walk into a store and say, hey, Mr. Dude that works at the cellar store, I want, something that goes with beef. I want a red wine. I kind of want this price range. Can you show me something in that range? All right. I want to walk up and down the aisles, and I might say, hey, why don't you take me to just the red wines, for example, right? So then I can say, let me just maximize this for you, because we made the header a bit big. I just want to have a look at the red wines, right? And I can just pick up a bottle and kind of virtually, zoom in on the bottle, right? Have a look at the label, touch it, feel it, sniff it. Is this the wine I want, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to replicate the in-store experience with a web-based experience. So I might have a scenario where I say, you know what? I want a red wine. Let's go to red wines. And I might zoom in and say, I like that one. Actually, I want something that goes with beef and steak. I don't care what type of wine it is. And you know what? I'm a pretty low price kind of guy, so I want something that's, $7. So, ladies. So I'm going to take Clover Hill, right? Because it's under $7 and the ladies like the champagne and they're not going to know it's under $7, right? And so this is the experience I get. I can explore and navigate this. The other scenario we get a lot is, hey, my wife loves this champagne. I can't remember what it's called, but I know it was in the Cellar Press. So Cellar Press is basically their catalogue, right? So this is everything that was in their catalogue, and I know it was a champagne. So let's look at things by type. Let's go to sparkling. Oh, that's it, the Pol Roger guy, right? I can read all about it. Don't really understand why my wife likes it. Oh, there you go, because the Queen likes it, right? So you can see I get this amazing immersive experience, which is totally data-driven. I can also fall back if I want to say, hey, let's clear this guy, and let's just search for Pol Roger, right? Right? And I get the same thing. Now, there is no code at all behind this control. This is a Silverlight control which is completely driven by the data. So I'll show you what the data looks like. So essentially it's this VC collection. Essentially it's just an XML file. So this is a reformatted OData feed. So at the moment Pivot doesn't take OData feeds out of the box. You have to reformat it with a shim if you want to do dynamic collections. Essentially all it says is, hey, these are the different attributes or facet categories. Is it in the Cellar Press? Is it a type? Is it variety? Do I want to show a filter? Do I want to show a word wheel, which is that kind of scroller up the top? Do I want to see the metadata, etc., etc.? And then it just says, actually, you know, here's, for each item, here's my deep zoom image for it. Right? So what happens is when the OData feed comes in, from, in this case, it's a Commerce Server feed, we basically reformat it for this. We also go and look up what the image is, and we create we create a deep zoom pyramid so that I can do that deep zooming on the web. And these are like 30 meg images, right? If I were to try and render that over the web, every time I'm trying to interact, it's insane. You can't do it, right? So I'll show you how these pyramids are made up. And then each of these is literally just, here's the facet, here's the value, right? And then Pivot responds because it's a data-driven experience. If you go in here and have a look at the files, here's my deep zoom collection. Now, the only file I had to create for that was the CXML. These ones are generated for me. There's this thing called the Deep Zoom Composer, which basically you give it an image and say, create a deep zoom image out of it, right? And it will break the file up into lots of different files. Yeah? So to really understand this is to look at the files, and not those files, these files. So these are all my products. Let's have a look at this file here. If you start off from the beginning, that's what it looks like when it's zoomed out. As I zoom in a little bit more, you can see it gets bigger, bigger. It's getting scary. It's getting really scary, right? And then you can see what it does is it builds the pyramid up. Yeah? So when I get down to the bottom, I get these very low-level images. Yeah? If you want to find out more about Pivot, the best place to go is getpivot.com. That has the control. It has a whole bunch of other videos. If you go to developer info, you can see there's a bunch of tools to create these pivot collections for you, either programmatically or otherwise. It defines the different types of collections, etc., etc. Just got one more slide I want to show you, which is good. It's not going to be live until February next year. And whether or not Pivot's going to be in it, we're still kind of debating how it's going to fit in. We did that as a prototype for the business and also as a demo for Remix. Some things about how do you create a great experience. Firstly, know your goals and audience. Now, it sounds silly, but I'll explain what that means in a sec. Treat your content appropriately. So you need a good mix of data and a good mix of images, but you don't have to have images. If you look at the Wikipedia collection, it has no images. They actually render tiles which are specific for the different categories. The other thing you need to do is design for distance. So you need to design for far away, for close, and for deep. All right? Great example of this, if I quickly switch back, just want to show you this. If you have a look at, just explore these collections, they're really fascinating actually. If you have a look at the dog breeds, not such fascinating in itself, but if you have a look, that's what it looks like from far away. This is what it looks like from close. What it looks like from a deep zoom point of view is awesome. See this funny looking dog here? Does anyone have this funny looking dog so I don't offend anyone? No? Cool. This funny looking dog is boring until you kind of deep zoom into his eye and you can see the photographer. Yeah? That's a deep zoom image, right? That's what OData, sorry, that's what Pivot and Deep Zoom give you, right? That is rendering off the web in real time. So you need to design interest into your data, into your catalog, so that you entice people to explore. So exposing it through OData is one thing, but thinking about how you did it is another thing. But also you need to know your goals and audience. So for example, in Pivot, we generally say do not use extreme aspect ratios. But if you look at the Vintage Cellars example, that is an extreme aspect ratio. You've got very thin and very tall bottles. Right? Generally does not look good in Pivot, and we actually tried to make them squares, and then we went, no, because the goal of our audience is to get a bottle shop experience. So by having lots of tall images, it looks like a wine on a rack, right? So you need to know when to break the general Pivot rules, and there's a whole bunch of other Pivot rules you can have a look at online. You also want to automate the production. right, which is very easy. There's code samples up there. There's also command line tools for generating those OData and those images, those pivot and image files. But also, if you're going to do tiles, you want to generate those as well, and be prepared to iterate around the experience. Yep. Getting your data out is one thing. Creating a compelling experience needs a lot of iteration. If you want to know more about how to expose, publish, consume, monetize data, go and look at Project Dallas. From there, once you've exposed it, whether internally or externally, you can look at OData for how to create a consistent head over that. And then pivot, go to getpivot.com to create immersive experience. Hope you got value out of that. I want to thank you again for coming and enjoy the last day of TechEd. Thanks a lot.